Welcome. Today we're talking with John Sanders and Melissa Pierano from Bridgeforce. John is the CEO and co-founder of Bridgeforce and has been an industry leader for more than 27 years. Melissa has more than 20 years experience in the payment sector and is a senior program manager at Bridgeforce. John and Melissa, welcome and thank you for joining us at today's Banker Digest.
Thanks for having us, Larry.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
Great. Okay. Well, Melissa, let's get started. We're hearing a lot about this buy now, pay later. What is it and what's all the excitement?
Sure. Thanks, Larry. There are several flavors of buy now, pay later, as we all call it, BNPL loans. But most commonly, we think of BNPL as an online point of sale financing where a consumer is offered a short-term loan. These have generally been smaller ticket sales with 4 to 6 payments spread out over, say, 6 to 8 weeks. However, we're seeing the market shift in a couple of major ways. First, we're seeing a shift from retail products to living expenses. We're seeing things like products that target auto repairs, rent payments, healthcare expenses, and of course, a shift to luxury items like vacations, flights, rental cars, hotel rooms, etc.
Right.
Second, we're seeing a more integration of the BNPL at the traditional point of sale, like an in-person sale. This probably isn't a surprise to anyone as we've seen the technology be successful online. So a migration to other platforms would be a no-brainer, right? And finally, the market keeps growing. As the product continues to mature, providers are continuing to enhance the consumer's experience. So expect to see BNPL even more tightly integrated in the consumer's payment journey, making it easier to use, providing that instant gratification folks love without the stigma of credit card debt.
Right. Right. Okay. Well, that's good. You know, it's interesting that the migration and the growth that you've talked about, because originally credit cards were positioned for that big purchase. And obviously today they're used for every possible transaction that you can imagine. So that's great. So thank you. But let's back up a little bit. John, is buy now, pay later a loan, or is it more like a retail contract?
Yeah, Larry, I think that's a question that the industry is broadly still contemplating. And one would look at it and say, if conventional wisdom prevails, it's a no-brainer. It's a lending product, right? For several with whom I speak, it's not even a thought. But for others, is it a loan or is it a retail contract maybe with a twist? And I do appreciate that perspective because it does behave more along the lines of a retail contract. So if you think of, instead of waiting to settle installments with the merchant before getting the goods or service like a traditional layaway plan, the NPL is simply allowing the customer to do so up front and then spread out the payments. So there's no credit pull. It's not really an extension of credit or alternative to credit. But my view, I like to keep it simple and look at fundamentals. And I ask our clients all the time when they discuss new product offerings, if let's just say we simply call it a financial arrangement, and if the consumer doesn't uphold their end of the deal, are you going to try to get payment or repossess the item? And often I get a funny look, and the answer is, well, of course. Well, where I come from, that's called lending. And not to be facetious, but if it looks like a loan, it acts like a loan, it's probably a loan. In terms of holding the risk, broadly speaking, it's a third-party provider. So the merchant gets paid immediately, and then it's the provider's responsibility to collect installment payments from the customer. So to the merchant, that means they can allow customers to pay over time with taking on any additional financial risk. These providers, they can be financial institutions, non-banks, and specialty finance companies, to name a few.
John, thank you. So, on your point there, so what are the risk management attributes of buy now, pay later?
I think, Larry, it's not unlike any other credit product. Certainly, BNPL is getting a lot of attention, and the fear of missing out seems to be a prevailing sentiment around the offering. But in terms of risk management, there's always a concern with the consumer product around the consumer getting in over their head and overextending themselves. For the provider, an economic downturn may on the surface create opportunity, say in the form of consumers seeking the utility. But that same consumer needs to eventually repay whatever obligation they've agreed upon. And if they have difficulty doing so, that obviously creates a risk. And then lastly, part of me sort of wonders about the potential for adverse selection and whether or not this offering may attract higher credit risk because the utility appeals to those who may not otherwise get credit elsewhere, and therefore they really need it. So I pose that more as a rhetorical thought, but it is food for thought. Another risk that we're pulsing is how this information gets reported to credit bureaus. And the three CRAs have publicly stated that they will begin reporting on BNPL, but what will that really look like?
Mhm.
And from what we've heard thus far, there's talk about reporting, but not factoring that into the credit score. So if that's true, as a consumer, does that really help or hurt my credit, right? As an underwriter, I suppose it's helpful to see that the consumer has other obligations and whether or not they were satisfied, as well as maybe having a view into the ability, basic things like the ability to calculate debt to income ratios. But Melissa and I were talking about the timing of the furnishing of this data, as it feels like a stacking risk that emerged with the advent of some fintechs. And Melissa, perhaps would you care to elaborate?
Sure. I mean, you think about the kind of spend that you could have in one day. If I started out the day using one of the fintechs that, for example, I can pay my rent on, then I go on a shopping spree and I buy some sandals and some toys for my kid's birthday, and then a coat, some boots. Later, you get the picture. I may have spent well over $1,000 in a day having spread my purchases across multiple providers. So they are, while one provider may not continue to extend me credit, I've successfully stacked a significant amount of debt, right? And that'll have a huge impact on what my score looks like and my ability to continue to build debt.
Yeah, I can see that exposure there. So thank you, John and Melissa. So Melissa, kind of picking up on that a little bit. So what is the regulatory situation around buy now, pay later?
Well, I mean, the CFPB is the natural agency to take a look at BNPL loans, especially given the concern around consumer harm specifically.
Okay.
And I know you probably know this, Larry, we've done work in the UK for years. The Financial Conduct Authority, or the FCA, is the UK's version of the CFPB.
Mhm.
And there's two interesting things that have been going on there. First, recently the FCA worked with the top 4 UK BNPL firms to change terms in their consumer contracts to make them fairer, easier for consumers to understand, and to better reflect how they actually use the product in practice.
Right.
Secondly, there's an explicit reference in the FCA's new guidance to something called consumer duty. This is coming into force in April of 2023. What this means to lenders, including BNPL lenders, is they have a much higher threshold when explaining pros and cons to consumers around the decision to use a product.
Okay.
So think about the BNPL world. This is going to be a challenge to providers who want that tight, seamless consumer journey, because they need to stop that and give them information to the consumer so that they know that this is what's going on and what product they're actually selecting, rather than it being kind of the no-brainer to pick BNPL for checkout.
Right.
So in the FCA's words, which I really want to get this right, the intention of Consumer Duty Initiative is to challenge a firm's purpose and its associated business models where they are not designed to deliver good consumer outcomes.
Right.
So overall, we've seen the FCA take that more maternal, paternal position to ensure consumers don't put themselves in a financial arrangement they can't handle. The relevance here is we've seen the CFPB follow the FCA's lead in the past and expect to, at least some degree, for them to do it again. And further, as people know, the CFPB has already made some moves around opening an inquiry at the end of last year, asking for data and clarity. And so kind of based on initial results from that, we continue to keep an eye on this, but do believe ultimately the CFPB will get involved around implementing protections like similar to what their UK counterparts have.
Right. Well, thank you, Melissa. Appreciate your sharing, that viewpoint and what's going on in the UK and how that might provide some guidance to US regulation. So John, how would my bank, what would they do to implement buy now, pay later the right way?
Yeah, sure. Great question. Interestingly, we are in a number of those active conversations with a number of organizations across the industry. And look, I just shoot straight. If I own the P&L for this product, I do a half dozen things. First, I would determine the use cases that make sense for my organization's risk appetite. So in other words, are you targeting things like unexpected dental expense, vet bills, the hot water heater or appliance that expired, and therefore BNPL is a utility to help take the edge off that budget gap?
Right.
Or are you casting the net far and wide with offers to spread the cost of, say, a $33 t-shirt purchase on Amazon across 4 payments of $8.25?
Right.
And I think the answer to that question will likely determine what customers will be attracted, and subsequently where you're probably going to be on the credit spectrum, whether it's prime, near prime, and so forth.
Mhm.
As recent as yesterday, I was reading about BNPL 2.0, affectionately called LNPL, Live Now, Pay Later. And that's intentionally targeting a demographic that values experiences over material purchases, and more to come, right? So that's step one. Second, I would determine the offering and be clear on the consumer communication. So as Melissa was just elaborating upon, this is a big regulatory focus.
Mhm.
So get it right and stay out of the UDAP penalty box. Third, I would employ good old-fashioned portfolio risk management practices. And Larry, I know this is something you greatly appreciate, but for example, P&L monitoring, early warning for higher risk consumers, all of the practices that we've proven worked well with traditional credit offerings. And this also includes exercising good discipline and not chasing profit too far down the credit curve, which might sound blasphemous, but it's to me prudent. And then lastly, I would turn my attention to the back office and make sure all back office capabilities can properly support the product. And this honestly should go without saying, but I still marvel at how fundamentals get missed: lack of process definition, controls, light on documentation, policies and procedures, operational training, so on and so forth. So bottom line, really think through the target operating model, create a plan, and then execute against it.
Great. Well, Melissa and John, thank you very much. Appreciate this. So as you discussed, Buy Now, Pay Later is growing strongly, expanding. More people are interested in it, more applications. But there are many aspects to understand before offering Buy Now, Pay Later as a payment product. So thank you for sharing your insights with us.
Our pleasure. Thanks for having us, Larry.
Thank you, Larry.
All right. In closing, thank you for joining today's Banker Digest. If you have additional questions for John or Melissa, please see the links in their bio.